"I'm not a killer. I'm a good man," the voice on the recording would later claim. But on June 14, 1962, 55-year-old Anna Sleezers lay dead in her Boston apartment, her bathrobe cord wrapped tightly around her neck, tied in a bow like a grotesque gift. She was the first victim of what would become one of America's most terrifying murder sprees, a reign of terror that would grip an entire city in paralyzing fear for nearly 2 years. Boston in the early 1960s was a city of tradition and transformation. The cobblestone streets of Beacon Hill held centuries of American history, while the bustling neighborhoods of Back Bay and the North End buzzed with the energy of a modern metropolis. Young women moved freely through these streets, walking alone after work, living independently in small apartments scattered throughout the city's diverse neighborhoods. They had no reason to fear the shadows, until Anna Sleezers changed everything. Anna had been preparing for an evening out when death found her. A seamstress and divorced mother, she lived alone in a modest third-floor apartment at 77 Gainsborough Street in the Back Bay area. Her son had planned to take her to see a performance that night, but when he arrived at her building and climbed those familiar stairs, his knocks went unanswered. The superintendent's key revealed a scene that would haunt investigators for decades. Anna's body was discovered in the hallway of her apartment, partially clothed, her bathrobe cord knotted around her neck with an almost ceremonial precision. But it wasn't just the ligature that sent chills through the responding officers. It was the deliberate staging, the way the cord was arranged in a bow beneath her chin, as if the killer had taken time to create some twisted form of presentation. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of robbery, no clear motive that investigators could immediately identify. Detective Lieutenant John Donovan arrived at the scene within hours, his practiced eye taking in details that would later prove crucial. The apartment showed no signs of struggle in the main living areas. Anna's purse remained untouched, her jewelry undisturbed. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was something far more sinister, something personal, methodical, and deeply disturbing. As word of the murder spread through Boston's law enforcement community, experienced detectives found themselves puzzled by the crime's characteristics. The killer had somehow gained entry without force, suggesting Anna may have known her attacker or been deceived into opening her door. The careful arrangement of the ligature spoke to a killer who took time with his work, who wasn't panicked or rushed. Most unsettling of all was the complete absence of any obvious motive. The investigation began immediately, with detectives canvassing the neighborhood, interviewing Anna's friends, co-workers, and acquaintances. She was described as a quiet, hard-working woman who kept to herself but was well-liked by those who knew her. She had no known enemies, no romantic entanglements that might have led to violence, no financial troubles that could have motivated an attack. Anna Sleezers appeared to have been chosen at random, a possibility that made every woman in Boston a potential target. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, where every mystery has a ticking timeline waiting to be uncovered. In the sweltering heat of that June evening, as investigators processed the crime scene and began their methodical search for answers, none of them could have imagined they were looking at the first piece of a puzzle that would eventually encompass 13 murders. None of them knew that Anna Sleezers' death marked the beginning of a killing spree that would transform Boston from a city where women walked freely into a place where every unlocked door, every evening alone, every stranger's smile carried the potential for deadly consequences. The Boston Strangler had claimed his first victim, and in the careful, almost ritualistic way Anna's body had been arranged, he had announced his presence to the world. The bow around her neck wasn't just a ligature. It was a signature, a calling card that would appear again and again in apartments across the city. And as the summer of 1962 stretched ahead, that signature would become the most feared symbol in Boston, a mark of death that would leave an entire metropolitan area looking over its shoulder, wondering when and where the killer would strike next. The clock had started ticking on one of America's most notorious murder cases, and time was running out for the women of Boston. 2 weeks passed after Anna Sleezers' murder, and Boston's residents were just beginning to file the tragedy into the back of their minds when death struck again. This time, the victim was 65-year-old Mary Mullen, found dead in her apartment at 1435 Commonwealth Avenue on June 28, 1962. Unlike Anna, Mary had died of a heart attack, but the circumstances surrounding her death would soon reveal a terrifying connection that would send shockwaves through the entire city. Mary's apartment showed clear signs of an intruder. Drawers had been pulled out, belongings scattered, and most chilling of all, a ligature had been placed around her neck, though investigators determined she had died before the killer could complete his grisly ritual. The medical examiner concluded that Mary had suffered fatal cardiac arrest, likely triggered by the terror of confronting her attacker. Even in death, she had denied the killer his twisted satisfaction. The Boston Police Department found themselves facing an uncomfortable reality. They might be dealing with a serial killer. Detective Lieutenant Donovan, who had worked Anna's case, immediately recognized the similarities, the lack of forced entry, the ligature placement, the absence of robbery as a motive. But it was the third murder, just 2 days later, that would transform individual tragedies into citywide panic. On June 30th, 1962, 68-year-old Nina Nichols was discovered in her Lynn apartment by her sister. The scene was grotesquely familiar. Nina's body arranged with the same careful precision as Anna's, her nylon stockings knotted around her neck in that now terrifying bow formation. The killer had taken time to pose her body, to arrange her clothing, to leave his unmistakable signature upon another innocent woman's final moments. News of the third murder exploded across Boston's media landscape like a powder keg igniting. The Boston Globe's headline screamed, "Strangler terrorizes city, 3 women dead." Television news broadcasts interrupted regular programming to warn residents of the growing threat. Radio stations issued hourly reminders for women to lock their doors, check their windows, and never admit strangers into their homes. Within 48 hours of Nina Nichols' discovery, Boston had transformed into a city under siege. Hardware stores reported runs on door locks, chains, and security devices. Locksmiths found themselves working around the clock, installing deadbolts and reinforcing entry points for terrified residents. Women who had walked confidently through the city's neighborhoods for years suddenly found themselves sprinting from subway stations to their apartments, keys clutched between their fingers like makeshift weapons. The psychological impact rippled through every level of society. Office buildings reported decreased productivity as female employees huddled in groups, sharing stories, theories, and fears. Beauty salons and grocery stores became impromptu support groups, where women discussed safety strategies and shared phone numbers for check-ins. The simple act of being alone, something millions of women had taken for granted, suddenly became an exercise in calculated risk. Phone calls between friends and family members increased exponentially. "Are you home safe?" became the standard greeting, replacing casual pleasantries with urgent welfare checks. Apartment building managers found themselves fielding dozens of calls from tenants requesting security upgrades, better lighting, and more frequent patrols. But perhaps most unsettling was the realization that the killer's victims seemed to be chosen completely at random. Anna Sleezers, Mary Mullen, and Nina Nichols shared no obvious connections beyond their gender and their vulnerability. They came from different neighborhoods, different social circles, different walks of life. The randomness meant that every woman in Boston, young or old, rich or poor, social or reclusive, was potentially the next target. Police departments throughout Greater Boston found themselves overwhelmed with calls. Every suspicious person, every strange noise, every unexpected knock at the door generated frantic phone calls to emergency services. The tip lines established for the Strangler investigation received hundreds of calls daily, most from well-meaning but terrified citizens reporting everything from unusual sounds in their buildings to men who looked at them strangely on the street. The media coverage intensified the fear, creating a feedback loop of terror that fed on itself. Newspapers printed detailed descriptions of the crime scenes, inadvertently providing the killer's methods like a how-to guide for copycat crimes. Television news programs featured security experts offering safety tips, but their very presence on screen served as a constant reminder of the danger lurking in the shadows. As July 1962 began, Boston's restaurants reported declining reservations for single women. Movie theaters saw sharp drops in female attendance at evening showings. The city's vibrant nightlife, a hallmark of its cultural identity, began to wither as fear replaced freedom. Women who had lived independently for years suddenly found themselves calling friends to stay overnight, unwilling to face the darkness alone. The Boston Strangler had claimed 3 victims in just 16 days, and his reign of terror was only beginning. With each passing night, the question wasn't whether he would strike again. It was who would be next, and whether the city's increasingly desperate police force could catch him before more innocent women paid the ultimate price for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. August 19, 1962. The summer heat hung over Boston like a suffocating blanket, but it wasn't the temperature that had 75-year-old Ida Erga opening her window that fatal evening. It was the desperate need for air, for relief, for a moment's peace from the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over the city since June. By morning, Ida would become the 4th confirmed victim of the Boston Strangler, and her death would reveal the killer's evolving methodology in ways that would both help and horrify investigators. Ida's body was discovered by her neighbor, concerned after not seeing the elderly woman for 2 days. The scene that greeted police was both familiar and disturbingly different from the previous murders. The bow tie ligature was there, Ida's stockings wound around her neck with that same grotesque precision. But this time, the killer had added new elements to his signature. Her legs had been spread apart and positioned deliberately, a pillow placed under her hips. The staging was becoming more elaborate, more personal, more sexually motivated. Detective Lieutenant Donovan stood in Ida's small apartment, studying the scene with the grim expertise of a man who had already seen too much. The killer's confidence was growing. Where the first murders had shown signs of haste, this scene revealed someone taking his time, someone comfortable enough in his methods to experiment, to elaborate, to transform murder into a twisted form of performance art. The psychological profile began to take shape in the minds of investigators. They were dealing with someone who gained entry through deception rather than force. All 4 victims had admitted their killer willingly. This suggested a man who appeared harmless, trustworthy, perhaps even helpful. Someone who could convince elderly women to open their doors despite the citywide warnings about the Strangler's presence. 2 weeks later, the pattern would become even more disturbing with the murder of 77-year-old Jane Sullivan. Found on August 30th in her Dorchester apartment, Jane had been dead for over a week before discovery. The killer's signature was present, the ligature, the positioning, the careful staging. But Jane's advanced age and the decomposition of her body prevented investigators from gathering crucial evidence that might have broken the case wide open. By September 1962, the Boston Police Department had established a dedicated task force consisting of 49 detectives working exclusively on the Strangler cases. Led by Detective Lieutenant John Donovan and Assistant Attorney General John Bottomley, the team represented the largest manhunt in Boston's history. They worked 16-hour days, following up on thousands of tips, interviewing hundreds of suspects, and slowly building a comprehensive understanding of their quarry. The killer's victim selection revealed a disturbing evolution. The first 5 murders had targeted older women, ranging in age from 55 to 77. All lived alone. All were found in their apartments. All had been killed with ligatures fashioned from their own clothing or household items. The lack of forced entry suggested the killer possessed an almost supernatural ability to gain trust, to appear harmless enough that vulnerable women would admit him into their most private spaces. But the investigation revealed something even more chilling. The killer was learning, adapting, refining his methods with each murder. Crime scene photographs showed increasingly elaborate staging, more deliberate positioning of the bodies, additional elements that suggested sexual motivation beyond the initial act of murder. The bow tie ligature had evolved from a simple, knot to an almost ritualistic arrangement, positioned and repositioned until it achieved whatever aesthetic the killer found satisfying. Psychological experts consulted by the task force painted a portrait of a man driven by deep-seated rage against women, likely stemming from childhood trauma or maternal relationships. The careful staging suggested someone with obsessive-compulsive tendencies, someone who needed to arrange his victims in specific ways to achieve psychological satisfaction. The ability to gain entry without force indicated someone who appeared non-threatening, possibly someone in a service capacity who would have legitimate reasons to request entry into apartments. The geographic distribution of the murders revealed another pattern. The killer wasn't striking randomly across Boston. He was focusing on specific neighborhoods, specific types of buildings, specific demographics. The Back Bay, Lynn, Dorchester, areas with older apartment buildings, where single women lived alone, where security was minimal and anonymity was high. As autumn approached, the task force had developed a comprehensive profile of their suspect. A white male, likely in his 20s or 30s, possibly employed in a service capacity that gave him access to apartment buildings, perhaps maintenance, delivery, or utilities. Someone physically unremarkable, trustworthy in appearance, with deep psychological problems masked by a facade of normalcy. But profiles and patterns meant nothing if they couldn't prevent the next murder. And as the leaves began to change color across Boston's tree-lined neighborhoods, the Strangler was already selecting his next victim, one whose death would shatter every assumption investigators had made about his methods, his motivations, and his intended targets. The elderly women of Boston had learned to live in fear, but what they didn't know, what no one could have predicted, was that the killer was about to change his pattern in ways that would exponentially multiply the terror and leave every woman in the city, regardless of age, wondering if she might be next. The morning of September 8, 1962, Boston Police Commissioner Edmund McNamara stood before a room filled with the city's most experienced homicide detectives, FBI agents, and state investigators. Behind him, a massive cork board displayed crime scene photographs, victim profiles, and a growing web of red string connecting locations, dates, and evidence. 5 women were dead, and the city was demanding answers that seemed increasingly elusive. "Gentlemen," McNamara began, his voice carrying the weight of public pressure and political necessity, "we are dealing with an individual who has turned murder into a science. Every conventional investigative approach has failed. It's time for something unprecedented." That morning marked the official formation of the Boston Strangler Task Force, the largest coordinated manhunt in Massachusetts history, comprising 49 detectives from multiple jurisdictions, all dedicated to one mission: stop the killer before he claimed another victim. Detective Lieutenant John Donovan, a 20-year veteran of the Boston Police Department, found himself at the center of an investigation unlike anything he had encountered. Donovan had worked hundreds of homicides, but the Strangler cases defied every pattern, every precedent, every logical approach to criminal investigation. The killer left no fingerprints, no witnesses, no physical evidence beyond the carefully arranged crime scenes. He was a ghost who somehow materialized in locked apartments, claimed his victims, and vanished without a trace. Assisting Donovan was Assistant Attorney General John Bottomley, a Harvard-educated lawyer whose analytical mind brought a different perspective to the investigation. While Donovan approached each crime scene with the intuition of a seasoned street cop, Bottomley dissected the murders with the precision of a legal scholar, searching for patterns, precedents, and psychological motivations that might reveal the killer's identity. The task force established headquarters in a converted warehouse in downtown Boston, transforming the space into a nerve center of criminal investigation. Dozens of telephone lines connected the operation to police departments across New England. Maps covered every available wall surface, marked with colored pins representing crime scenes, suspect locations, and potential leads. Filing cabinets groaned under the weight of thousands of tip sheets, witness statements, and investigative reports. Dr. James Brussel, the pioneering criminal psychiatrist who had successfully profiled the Mad Bomber of New York, was brought in to develop a psychological portrait of the Strangler. Dr. Brussel spent days studying crime scene photographs, autopsy reports, and victim profiles, ultimately producing a detailed analysis that would prove remarkably prescient. He described the killer as a physically powerful man in his late 20s, probably of Italian or Spanish descent, with a history of trouble with women. He would be neat in appearance, possibly employed in a hospital or similar institution, and would likely live alone with an older female relative. The investigation employed cutting-edge forensic techniques that were revolutionary for 1962. Fiber analysis experts examined microscopic threads found at crime scenes. Handwriting specialists analyzed notes and potential evidence. Photographers created detailed documentation of every crime scene element. searching for clues that might have been overlooked during initial investigations. But the most innovative aspect of the task force was its use of early computer technology. IBM had donated time on their mainframe systems to help analyze the massive amounts of data the investigation was generating. Thousands of suspect names, alibis, and characteristics were fed into the computers, which then cross-referenced the information to identify potential matches with the killer's profile. The task force divided their investigation into specialized units. One team focused exclusively on the crime scenes, revisiting each location multiple times to ensure no evidence was overlooked. Another unit handled the endless stream of tips and leads flooding in from the public. A third group concentrated on developing and following up on suspects, while a fourth managed the complex logistics of coordinating multiple jurisdictions and agencies. Every day brought new challenges. The media attention was both a blessing and a curse. Publicity generated tips and kept the public vigilant, but it also created enormous pressure for quick results. Politicians demanded daily updates. Citizens groups organized to demand more police protection. Business leaders complained about the economic impact of women afraid to go out alone. The psychological toll on the investigators was immense. These experienced detectives found themselves haunted by crime scene photographs, unable to escape the images of carefully arranged bodies and that grotesque bow-tie ligature that had become the Strangler's calling card. Many worked 18-hour days, sustained by coffee, determination, and the knowledge that every day they failed to catch the killer might be another woman's last. Witness protection became a critical concern as the investigation progressed. Several witnesses had reported seeing suspicious individuals near crime scenes, but fear of the Strangler's potential retaliation made many reluctant to provide detailed statements. The task force developed elaborate protocols to protect witness identities while still gathering crucial information. International cooperation expanded the investigation's reach. Similar cases in other cities were analyzed for potential connections. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit provided additional psychological insights. Even Scotland Yard offered consultation on serial killer investigations, though such crimes were still relatively rare and poorly understood. As October 1962 approached, the task force had interviewed over 2,500 suspects, followed up on more than 5,000 tips, and created the most comprehensive criminal database in American history. They had developed revolutionary investigative techniques that would influence criminal investigations for decades to come. But despite all their resources, all their expertise, all their dedication, the Boston Strangler remained free. And he was about to demonstrate just how much more dangerous he could become. December 5, 1962. 20-year-old Sophie Clark was preparing for an evening at home when death knocked on her apartment door at 315 Huntington Avenue. Unlike the Strangler's previous victims, Sophie was young, vibrant, and African American, a departure from the pattern that had given investigators false hope they were beginning to understand their adversary. Her murder would shatter every assumption about the killer's preferences and send a fresh wave of terror through Boston's younger population. Sophie's roommates discovered her body when they returned from their evening classes at the Carnegie Institute of Medical Technology. The scene was devastatingly familiar, yet horrifyingly evolved. The ligature around her neck formed from her own stockings, tied in that grotesque bow that had become the Strangler's signature. But this time, the positioning was even more deliberate, more sexually explicit, suggesting the killer's fantasies were becoming increasingly elaborate and disturbing. The murder sent shockwaves through Boston's African-American community, which had watched the previous attacks with concern, but had felt somewhat insulated by the killer's apparent focus on elderly white women. Sophie's death proved that safety was an illusion. The Strangler's appetite for violence recognized no boundaries of age or race. Every woman in Boston was now a potential target. 3 weeks later, on December 30th, the killer struck again with stunning brutality. 23-year-old Patricia Bissett was found strangled in her apartment at 515 Park Drive, her body arranged with the same careful precision that had become the Strangler's trademark. Patricia was a secretary at a Boston engineering firm, well-liked by her colleagues, with no known enemies or dangerous associations. She had simply been in the wrong place when the killer came calling. But it was the murder that occurred on New Year's Eve that would haunt investigators for decades. Mary Sullivan, just 19 years old and new to Boston, had moved to the city with dreams of making it as a model or actress. She shared an apartment with 2 roommates in the Charles River Park development, a modern complex that was supposed to represent safety and security for young professionals. Mary's roommates found her body on January 4, 1964, when they returned from their holiday vacation. The scene was the most disturbing yet. Mary had been posed in a sitting position against her bedroom headboard, a grotesque parody of a fashion photograph. The ligature was tied with the killer's signature bow, but additional elements had been added. A card reading "Happy New Year" had been placed at her feet, along with other items that suggested the killer had spent considerable time arranging his tableau of death. The medical examiner's report on Mary Sullivan revealed details that chilled even experienced investigators. The killer had not only murdered the young woman, but had subjected her to a prolonged assault that spoke to escalating psychological deviation. The careful staging, the symbolic elements, the time spent at the scene, all indicated a killer whose confidence had grown to the point where he felt secure enough to elaborate on his gruesome rituals. Detective Lieutenant Donovan stood in Mary Sullivan's bedroom, studying the scene with the grim recognition that they were dealing with someone whose psychological profile was rapidly evolving. The shift from elderly victims to young women represented more than a change in preference. It suggested a killer whose needs were becoming more complex, more demanding, more dangerous with each murder. The psychological impact on Boston's young women was immediate and devastating. College dormitories implemented unprecedented security measures. Young professionals who had moved to Boston for career opportunities began fleeing back to their family homes in smaller towns and suburbs. Those who remained formed elaborate buddy systems, ensuring that no woman was ever truly alone. The task force found themselves essentially starting over with their investigation. The profile Dr. Brussel had developed focused on someone with issues relating to older women, possibly maternal figures. The murders of Sophie, Patricia, and Mary suggested either a different killer or someone whose psychological needs were far more complex than initially understood. Tips and leads poured into the task force headquarters at an unprecedented rate. Every suspicious person, every strange encounter, every unusual behavior became potential evidence in the minds of a terrified public. The investigation team found themselves drowning in information, much of it false or irrelevant, but all of it requiring careful analysis and follow-up. The media coverage intensified to a fever pitch. Newspapers published detailed safety guides for women living alone. Television news programs featured nightly updates on the investigation's progress. Radio stations broadcast hourly reminders about door locks, window security, and the importance of never admitting strangers. The city had become obsessed with its own vulnerability. Business owners reported dramatic changes in consumer behavior. Evening entertainment venues saw sharp declines in female attendance. Apartment rental offices found it increasingly difficult to lease units to single women. Restaurants, theaters, and shops adjusted their hours and security measures to accommodate a population living in constant fear. The killer's ability to gain entry without force remained the most puzzling aspect of the crimes. Young women like Sophie, Patricia, and Mary were far more cautious than the elderly victims had been. They were aware of the Strangler's presence in the city, yet somehow he had convinced them to open their doors. This suggested either elaborate deception or someone whose appearance and manner were so disarming that even vigilant young women trusted him enough to admit him into their homes. As winter gave way to spring in 1964, Boston had become a city divided by fear. The Strangler had claimed at least 11 victims, possibly more, and had demonstrated an ability to adapt his methods, his targets, and his techniques in ways that kept investigators constantly off balance. The massive task force, despite all its resources and expertise, seemed no closer to catching him than they had been 2 years earlier. But unknown to the public, to the media, and even to most of the investigators, the break they had been desperately seeking was about to come from an entirely unexpected source. October 27, 1964. The name Albert DeSalvo meant nothing to the Boston Strangler task force when it first appeared in a routine police report from Cambridge. A 33-year-old maintenance worker with a wife and 2 children, DeSalvo had been arrested for breaking and entering, a minor crime that would normally warrant little attention from overworked detectives. But the circumstances of his arrest would ultimately unravel one of America's most notorious murder cases. DeSalvo had been caught in the apartment of a young woman, claiming he was there to do repair work. When the woman became suspicious and called police, DeSalvo fled but was quickly apprehended. During questioning, he seemed unusually cooperative, even chatty, displaying a strange eagerness to discuss his activities and motivations. Detective Lieutenant John Donovan, called in to interview him about potential connections to other break-ins, found himself intrigued by DeSalvo's demeanor and his detailed knowledge of apartment layouts throughout Boston. What made DeSalvo particularly interesting was his employment history. He worked for a company that provided maintenance services to apartment buildings throughout the metropolitan area, exactly the type of position that would give someone legitimate reasons to knock on doors, to be admitted into women's apartments, to know building layouts and security weaknesses. His work records showed he had been in the vicinity of several Strangler crime scenes around the times of the murders. But the real breakthrough came when DeSalvo began talking about his other activities. With remarkable candor, he described a pattern of behavior that investigators had been tracking for months, a series of sexual assaults and break-ins that had terrorized women throughout Boston and surrounding areas. DeSalvo claimed responsibility for hundreds of incidents, providing details that only the perpetrator could have known. Dr. Ames Roby, a psychiatrist at Bridgewater State Hospital where DeSalvo was being held for observation, became fascinated by his patient's complex psychology. DeSalvo exhibited an unusual combination of intelligence and sexual deviance, coupled with an almost compulsive need to confess his crimes. He spoke of an insatiable sexual appetite that drove him to assault women, describing his actions with a clinical detachment that was both helpful to investigators and deeply disturbing. During their sessions, Dr. Roby began to suspect that DeSalvo's criminal activities extended far beyond the break-ins and assaults he had already admitted. The psychiatrist's careful questioning revealed knowledge of crime scenes, victim details, and murder methods that suggested direct involvement in the Strangler killings. But getting DeSalvo to admit to murder would require a different approach. Assistant Attorney General John Bottomley made the decision to personally interview DeSalvo, bringing along a carefully selected team of investigators and psychological experts. The interviews took place over several weeks, with DeSalvo gradually revealing more details about his activities throughout Boston. His memory for specific apartments, specific women, and specific dates was remarkable and increasingly incriminating. The breakthrough moment came when DeSalvo began describing the murder of Mary Sullivan with accuracy that stunned investigators. He provided details about the apartment layout, the victim's appearance, and the crime scene staging that had never been released to the public. He described the Happy New Year card, the positioning of the body, and other elements that only the killer could have known. The confession was both a relief and a nightmare. Finally, they had their man, but the details he provided were more horrifying than anyone had imagined. DeSalvo's confessions revealed the mind of a killer whose crimes were driven by a complex mixture of sexual compulsion and psychological rage. He described gaining entry to apartments by posing as a maintenance worker, a delivery person, or someone conducting surveys. His friendly demeanor and professional appearance made women comfortable enough to admit him, even in a city terrorized by the Strangler's presence. The killer's evolution from elderly to young victims wasn't random, DeSalvo explained. It reflected his growing confidence and his escalating sexual needs. The careful staging of bodies wasn't ritualistic behavior, but rather his attempt to create what he called artistic scenes. The bow tie ligatures weren't symbolic, but simply his preferred method of ensuring death, while maintaining the positioning he found aesthetically pleasing. But even as DeSalvo confessed to murder after murder, providing details that convinced investigators of his guilt, questions began to emerge about the reliability of his statements. His confessions were remarkably detailed about some aspects of the crimes, but vague or inconsistent about others. He seemed to have an encyclopedic knowledge of Boston apartments and their female occupants, but his timeline for some murders didn't align perfectly with witness statements or physical evidence. Dr. Roby and other psychiatric experts who examined DeSalvo noted his unusual psychology. A man driven by compulsions he couldn't control, but able to function normally in society between his violent episodes. He was articulate, even charming, with an ability to read people and situations that made him extremely dangerous. His capacity for deception was remarkable, leading some to wonder if he might be deceiving them even in his confessions. The investigation team found themselves in the unusual position of having their primary suspect confess to the crimes they had been investigating for over 2 years, while simultaneously questioning whether those confessions were completely accurate. DeSalvo knew details that only the killer could know, but he also demonstrated an ability to absorb and regurgitate information that raised questions about the source of his knowledge. As 1964 came to a close, the Boston Strangler task force believed they had solved the case that had terrorized their city. But Albert DeSalvo's confessions would prove to be just the beginning of a legal and psychological puzzle that would continue for decades, raising questions about guilt, mental illness, and the nature of criminal confession that remain unanswered to this day. The clock that had been ticking for Boston's women since June 1962 was finally winding down, but the story of the Boston Strangler was far from over. March 6, 1965. The tape recorder in the interview room at Bridgewater State Hospital clicked on as Albert DeSalvo settled into his chair across from Assistant Attorney General John Bottomley. What followed over the next several hours would be one of the most detailed and disturbing confessions in criminal history, a meticulous recreation of 13 murders that had terrorized Boston for nearly 3 years. "I want to tell you about Anna," DeSalvo began, referring to Anna Sleezers, the first victim. His voice was calm, almost conversational, as he described entering her apartment building on that June afternoon in 1962. He had posed as a maintenance worker, he explained, carrying a toolbox and wearing coveralls that made him appear completely legitimate to any resident who might see him in the hallways. DeSalvo's memory for detail was extraordinary and deeply unsettling. He described Anna's apartment layout with perfect accuracy, down to the placement of furniture and the color of the curtains. He knew what she was wearing, how she had reacted when he knocked on her door, and the exact words of their brief conversation before he attacked her. Most chilling of all, he described the careful way he had arranged her body after death, tying the bathrobe cord in the bow formation that would become his signature. The bow was important, DeSalvo told his stunned listeners. It had to be perfect, you understand? Like a present. I was giving something back. His clinical description of murder as a form of artistic expression revealed a psychology so twisted that even experienced investigators found themselves struggling to maintain professional composure. As the confession continued, DeSalvo moved methodically through each murder, providing details that had never been released to the public. He described Mary Mullen's heart attack, explaining how he had intended to strangle her, but she had died of fright before he could complete his ritual. He knew about the scattered belongings in her apartment, the position where her body was found, even the medication she had been taking for her heart condition. The confession to Nina Nichols' murder was particularly disturbing because of the additional details DeSalvo provided. He described her sister's regular visits, explaining how he had timed his attack to ensure they wouldn't be interrupted. He knew about the photographs on her dresser, the television program she had been watching, and the way she had pleaded for her life before he silenced her forever. Dr. Ames Roby observed DeSalvo carefully throughout these sessions, noting the man's strange emotional detachment from his own words. DeSalvo spoke about murder with the same tone others might use to describe their daily commute. There was no remorse, no emotional connection to the suffering he had caused, only a matter-of-fact recounting of events that seemed to hold some private satisfaction for him. When DeSalvo began describing the murders of younger victims like Sophie Clark and Patricia Bissett, his demeanor changed subtly. His descriptions became more detailed, more sexually explicit, revealing the evolution of his crimes from simple murder to elaborate sexual fantasy. He explained how he had studied his potential victims, learning their routines, their habits, their vulnerabilities before making his approach. The confession to Mary Sullivan's murder was the most detailed and disturbing of all. DeSalvo described spending over 2 hours in her apartment after killing her, arranging and rearranging her body until he achieved the grotesque tableau that had shocked even experienced detectives. He knew about the Happy New Year card, the specific positioning of her limbs, and additional elements that had been kept secret from the media. She was so young, DeSalvo said, showing the first hint of emotion during his confession. But that made it more exciting, you understand? The young ones fought harder. They made it more interesting. His words revealed a killer who had derived pleasure not just from murder, but from the terror and struggle of his victims. But even as DeSalvo provided these shocking details, inconsistencies began to emerge that troubled investigators. His timeline for some murders didn't align perfectly with established facts. He seemed to have perfect recall for some aspects of the crimes, but was vague or confused about others. Most puzzling of all, his descriptions of the murder weapons and methods were sometimes at odds with autopsy findings. Defense attorney F. Lee Bailey, who had been assigned to represent DeSalvo, found himself in the unusual position of having a client who wanted to confess to crimes that could result in his execution. Bailey questioned whether DeSalvo was mentally competent to stand trial, pointing to his obvious psychological disorders and his compulsive need to claim responsibility for crimes regardless of the consequences. The medical and psychiatric evaluations of DeSalvo revealed a man with an extraordinarily high sex drive coupled with deep-seated psychological problems. He claimed to have assaulted over 300 women throughout his adult life, describing his compulsions as something beyond his control. The boundary between truth and fantasy in his mind seemed almost non-existent, leading some experts to question whether he could distinguish between crimes he had actually committed and ones he had heard about or imagined. Prison officials noted DeSalvo's strange behavior even while incarcerated. He would spend hours drawing detailed diagrams of apartment layouts, creating elaborate floor plans that seemed to correspond to buildings throughout Boston. He maintained detailed journals describing women he had encountered, rating them according to various criteria that revealed his disturbed psychological state. As news of DeSalvo's confessions leaked to the media, Boston began to breathe easier for the first time in years. The monster who had terrorized their city finally had a name and a face. But for investigators and legal experts, DeSalvo's confessions raised as many questions as they answered. Was this the real Boston Strangler? Or was he an attention-seeking mentally ill man who had convinced himself he was responsible for crimes he had only heard about? The complex psychological profile that emerged from months of interviews painted a picture of a man whose relationship with reality was tenuous at best. He seemed to inhabit a fantasy world where his sexual conquests and violent crimes blended together into a narrative of power and control that may have existed more in his mind than in actual fact. As 1965 progressed toward DeSalvo's eventual trial, one thing became clear. The question of whether Albert DeSalvo was the Boston Strangler would prove far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The more investigators examined Albert DeSalvo's confessions, the more troubling discrepancies they discovered. While his knowledge of certain crime scene details was undeniably accurate, other aspects of his statements contradicted established facts in ways that raised serious questions about his reliability as a witness, even against himself. Detective Lieutenant Donovan spread the case files across his desk, comparing DeSalvo's confessions to the original investigation reports. The inconsistencies were numerous and significant. DeSalvo claimed to have strangled Ida Erga with her stockings, but the autopsy clearly showed she had been killed with a pillowcase. He described Mary Mullen as being found in her bedroom, when she had actually been discovered in her living room. Most troubling of all, his physical descriptions of several victims were inaccurate in ways that seemed impossible if he had actually encountered them. Dr. James Brussel, the psychiatrist who had created the original profile of the Boston Strangler, found himself questioning whether DeSalvo matched the psychological characteristics he had predicted. While DeSalvo exhibited some traits from the profile, the need for control, the sexual motivation, the ability to appear harmless, other aspects didn't align. The profile suggested someone with deep-seated rage against maternal figures, but DeSalvo's relationship with his mother, while troubled, didn't match the expected pattern. F. Lee Bailey, DeSalvo's defense attorney, commissioned independent psychiatric evaluations that revealed even more complex questions about his client's mental state. Multiple experts diagnosed DeSalvo with various psychological disorders, but they disagreed about his competency to stand trial and his ability to distinguish between reality and fantasy. Some psychiatrists believed he was genuinely the Boston Strangler. Others thought he was a deeply disturbed man who had convinced himself he was responsible for crimes he had only read about. The physical evidence presented additional problems. Despite DeSalvo's detailed confessions, forensic experts could find no concrete physical evidence linking him to any of the crime scenes. No fingerprints, no DNA evidence, which wasn't available in 1965, no fibers or other trace evidence that would definitively prove his presence at the murder scenes. For a killer who had supposedly spent hours arranging his victims' bodies, the complete absence of physical evidence was puzzling. Perhaps most troubling were the witness accounts that contradicted DeSalvo's confessions. Several residents of buildings where murders occurred reported seeing suspicious individuals who didn't match DeSalvo's appearance. A neighbor of Sophie Clark described a different man entirely, taller, thinner, and older than DeSalvo. These witness descriptions had been collected immediately after the murders, when memories were fresh and before DeSalvo's image had been publicized. Assistant Attorney General John Bottomley found himself in an unprecedented legal position. He had a suspect who was confessing to 13 murders, providing details that seemed to confirm his guilt, but the evidence supporting those confessions was circumstantial at best. More problematic still, there was growing speculation that DeSalvo might not be competent to stand trial for capital murder charges. The case took an unexpected turn when investigators discovered that DeSalvo had been in prison during the time period when at least 2 of the murders occurred. His alibi for those dates was ironclad. He was incarcerated on other charges and couldn't possibly have committed the crimes he was claiming responsibility for. Yet he continued to insist he was guilty of all 13 murders, becoming agitated when confronted with evidence that contradicted his confessions. Medical experts who examined DeSalvo noted his extraordinary ability to absorb and regurgitate information. He had an almost photographic memory for details he had read or heard about, and he seemed capable of constructing elaborate fantasies that incorporated real facts into fictional narratives. This talent made him particularly dangerous as a witness, even against himself, because he could provide accurate details about crimes he may not have committed. The Boston Police Department faced increasing pressure from the public and media to close the case. Citizens wanted to believe the nightmare was over, that the monster who had terrorized their city was finally behind bars. Politicians demanded resolution to a case that had dominated headlines for 3 years. But experienced investigators privately harbored doubts about whether they had captured the real killer. George Nassar, DeSalvo's cellmate at Bridgewater State Hospital, emerged as a key figure in the controversy surrounding the confessions. Nassar, who was himself suspected of murder, had spent months talking with DeSalvo about the Strangler cases. Some investigators believed that Nassar had provided DeSalvo with inside information about the crimes, possibly in exchange for DeSalvo taking responsibility and allowing the real killer to escape justice. The timeline of DeSalvo's confessions also raised questions. He hadn't spontaneously confessed to being the Boston Strangler. Instead, he had gradually been led to these admissions through months of interviews and psychological evaluation. Critics argued that the confession process itself might have planted false memories or encouraged DeSalvo to claim responsibility for crimes he hadn't committed. Family members of the victims found themselves divided about DeSalvo's guilt. Some were convinced that his detailed knowledge of the crime scenes proved he was the killer. Others pointed to the inconsistencies and questioned whether the real murderer was still free. The lack of definitive physical evidence left many families without the closure they desperately sought. Legal experts debated whether confessions alone, without corroborating physical evidence, should be sufficient for conviction in capital cases. DeSalvo's case was becoming a landmark in criminal law, raising questions about the reliability of psychological evaluations, the competency of mentally ill defendants, and the standards of evidence required for murder convictions. As the case moved toward trial, one fact became increasingly clear. Albert DeSalvo might be many things: a sexual predator, a burglar, a deeply disturbed individual. But whether he was actually the Boston Strangler remained an open question that would haunt investigators, legal experts, and the victims' families for decades to come. The truth about the Boston Strangler was proving to be as elusive as the killer himself had been during those terrifying years when women throughout Boston lived in fear of every knock on their door. January 10, 1967. Albert DeSalvo sat in the defendant's chair at Middlesex Superior Court, but he wasn't on trial for the crimes that had made him infamous. In a legal maneuver that shocked the public and frustrated investigators, DeSalvo was being tried not for the Boston Strangler murders, but for earlier crimes of assault, breaking and entering, and armed robbery, charges that predated his confessions and carried far less severe penalties. F. Lee Bailey, DeSalvo's defense attorney, had orchestrated this strategic decision with calculated precision. Bailey recognized that the inconsistencies in DeSalvo's confessions made a murder conviction uncertain, while the evidence for the earlier crimes was overwhelming. More importantly, Bailey was pursuing an insanity defense that would keep his client in a mental institution rather than the electric chair. The decision not to prosecute DeSalvo directly for the Strangler murders created a legal paradox that continues to perplex experts decades later. The prosecution, led by Assistant Attorney General John Bottomley, found themselves in the unusual position of having a defendant who wanted to be tried for murder while they pursued lesser charges with more certain outcomes. During the trial, Bailey presented a complex picture of his client as a man driven by uncontrollable sexual compulsions. Expert witnesses testified about DeSalvo's extraordinary sexual appetite. He claimed to need sexual release 5 or 6 times daily, and his inability to control his impulses when confronted with attractive women. The defense painted him as a victim of his own psychology, more deserving of treatment than punishment. Dr. Ames Roby took the stand to describe months of psychiatric sessions with DeSalvo, revealing a mind that seemed to exist in a permanent state of sexual fantasy. DeSalvo had confessed to assaulting over 300 women during his adult life, describing these encounters with a clinical detachment that suggested complete dissociation from the emotional impact on his victims. But the most dramatic moment of the trial came when DeSalvo himself took the stand. Against his attorney's advice, he insisted on testifying about his role as the Boston Strangler. In a packed courtroom, with families of victims watching from the gallery, DeSalvo calmly described the murders that had terrorized Boston for nearly 3 years. "I killed those women," DeSalvo stated matter-of-factly. "I went to their apartments, I gained their trust, and I strangled them. The bow tie around the neck, that was my signature. I wanted people to know it was me." His testimony was chilling in its emotional emptiness, delivered as if he were describing someone else's actions rather than his own. Under cross-examination, however, the inconsistencies that had troubled investigators became apparent to the jury. DeSalvo couldn't explain why his timeline for several murders was incorrect, why his physical descriptions of victims were inaccurate, or why no physical evidence linked him to any of the crime scenes. When pressed about specific details, he became agitated and began contradicting his own previous statements. The prosecution presented evidence of DeSalvo's other crimes, the break-ins, the assaults, the pattern of behavior that had brought him to police attention. They argued that while he might be the Boston Strangler, the evidence for these earlier crimes was indisputable and deserved punishment regardless of his mental state. George Nassar, DeSalvo's former cellmate, was called as a witness, though his testimony raised more questions than it answered. Nassar admitted to discussing the Strangler cases extensively with DeSalvo, but denied providing him with inside information. However, under questioning, it became clear that Nassar had access to details about the murders through his own contacts in the criminal justice system. The jury faced an almost impossible decision. They were being asked to convict a man who was clearly mentally ill of crimes that were well documented, while ignoring his confessions to far more serious crimes for which the evidence was circumstantial. The disconnect between DeSalvo's obvious guilt in the lesser charges and his questionable confessions to murder created a surreal courtroom atmosphere. Medical experts testified about DeSalvo's various psychological disorders, but they disagreed about his legal competency and his ability to distinguish between reality and fantasy. Some psychiatrists believed his confessions were genuine products of a guilty conscience. Others thought they were elaborate fantasies constructed by a deeply disturbed mind seeking attention and notoriety. The prosecution's strategy focused on establishing a pattern of criminal behavior that supported DeSalvo's capacity for violence against women. They presented evidence of his escalating crimes, from voyeurism to breaking and entering to sexual assault, arguing that murder was a logical progression in his criminal evolution. Bailey countered by emphasizing his client's mental illness and his genuine belief in his own guilt for the Strangler murders. He argued that DeSalvo's confessions, whether accurate or not, demonstrated a psychotic break from reality that rendered him legally insane and deserving of treatment rather than punishment. On February 25, 1967, after deliberating for nearly 11 hours, the jury returned their verdict: guilty on all counts of assault, breaking and entering, and armed robbery. They rejected the insanity defense but recommended psychiatric treatment. DeSalvo was sentenced to life imprisonment, effectively ending any possibility that he would ever stand trial for the Boston Strangler murders. The verdict satisfied no one completely. Victims' families felt cheated of justice for the murders that had terrorized their city. Legal experts questioned whether the real Boston Strangler had escaped prosecution. The public remained divided about DeSalvo's actual guilt in the murder cases. DeSalvo himself seemed oddly pleased with the outcome. He had achieved the notoriety he apparently craved while avoiding the electric chair. In interviews following his conviction, he continued to insist he was the Boston Strangler, seeming to relish the attention his claims generated. The trial had resolved the legal questions surrounding Albert DeSalvo's fate, but it had done nothing to definitively answer whether he was actually responsible for the 13 murders attributed to the Boston Strangler. That question would continue to haunt investigators, legal experts, and the victims' families for decades to come, creating a legacy of doubt that no courtroom verdict could dispel. November 25, 1973. Albert DeSalvo was found stabbed to death in his cell at Walpole State Prison, his body discovered by guards during a routine morning check. The man who had claimed to be the Boston Strangler was himself murdered, taking with him any possibility that the truth about his confessions would ever be definitively resolved. His death only deepened the mystery surrounding one of America's most notorious serial killer cases. In the years following DeSalvo's conviction and death, new evidence continued to emerge that challenged the official narrative of the Boston Strangler case. Advanced forensic techniques unavailable in the 1960s raised questions about whether a single killer was responsible for all 13 murders. DNA analysis, crime scene reconstruction, and behavioral profiling suggested that the victims might have been killed by multiple perpetrators rather than one prolific serial killer. Detective Lieutenant John Donovan, who had spent years investigating the case, never fully believed that DeSalvo was responsible for all the murders. In interviews given decades after the crimes, Donovan expressed doubts about the consistency of the killer's methods, the timeline of the murders, and DeSalvo's ability to have committed crimes while he was provably incarcerated on other charges. The advancement of DNA technology in the 1990s and 2000s offered new opportunities to examine physical evidence from the crime scenes. In 2013, authorities exhumed DeSalvo's body to obtain DNA samples for comparison with genetic material found on Mary Sullivan, the final confirmed victim of the Boston Strangler. The results were inconclusive. While DeSalvo couldn't be definitively ruled out as Sullivan's killer, the evidence wasn't strong enough to confirm his guilt either. Casey Sherman, Mary Sullivan's nephew, spent decades investigating his aunt's murder and became convinced that DeSalvo was not the Boston Strangler. Sherman's research revealed inconsistencies in DeSalvo's confessions, timeline problems that were never adequately explained, and alternative suspects who were never fully investigated by the original task force. The families of other victims remained divided about DeSalvo's guilt. Some found comfort in believing the case was solved, while others continued to search for answers about what really happened to their loved ones. The lack of physical evidence linking DeSalvo to any of the crime scenes left many questions unanswered and prevented the closure that families desperately sought. Criminal profilers who have examined the Boston Strangler case in recent decades point to significant differences in the killer's methods that suggest multiple perpetrators. The murders of elderly women showed different behavioral patterns than the killings of younger victims. The evolution in crime scene staging and sexual violence could indicate either a single killer whose methods evolved or different killers altogether. George Nasser, DeSalvo's former cellmate, remained a person of interest to some investigators who believed he might have been the real Boston Strangler. Nasser's background, his access to information about the crimes, and his relationship with DeSalvo created theories that he had manipulated DeSalvo into claiming responsibility for murders Nasser had actually committed. However, these theories were never substantiated with concrete evidence. The Boston Strangler case transformed criminal investigation techniques and legal procedures in ways that continue to influence law enforcement today. The massive task force, the use of early computer technology for data analysis, and the development of psychological profiling all became standard practices in serial killer investigations. The case also highlighted the importance of preserving physical evidence for future technological analysis. Lee Bailey's defense strategy in the DeSalvo trial became a landmark in criminal law, particularly regarding the use of insanity defenses and the handling of mentally ill defendants. The case raised important questions about the reliability of confessions from psychologically disturbed individuals and the standards of evidence required for murder convictions. The media coverage of the Boston Strangler case established patterns for reporting on serial killer investigations that persist today. The intensive focus on the killer's psychology, the detailed coverage of crime scenes, and the public's fascination with the perpetrator's identity all became hallmarks of serial killer coverage in American media. Boston itself was permanently changed by the Strangler murders. The atmosphere of fear that gripped the city during those terrifying years led to lasting changes in personal security practices, apartment building safety measures, and police procedures. The case marked the end of an era when women felt safe living alone and walking freely through urban neighborhoods. Modern investigators who have reviewed the Boston Strangler files often conclude that the case was closed prematurely due to public pressure and political considerations rather than definitive evidence. The rush to accept DeSalvo's confessions, despite their obvious inconsistencies, may have prevented the real killer or killers from ever being identified and prosecuted. Today, nearly 60 years after Anna Sleezers was found murdered in her Back Bay apartment, the Boston Strangler case remains officially solved but unofficially disputed. Albert DeSalvo is remembered as one of America's most notorious serial killers, yet serious questions persist about whether he actually committed the crimes that made him infamous. The case serves as a reminder of the complexities inherent in criminal investigations and the dangers of accepting convenient solutions to complex problems. It highlights the importance of physical evidence, the fallibility of confessions, and the lasting impact that unsolved questions can have on victims' families and communities. The women who died during those terrifying years, Anna Sleezers, Mary Mullen, Nina Nichols, Ida Erga, Jane Sullivan, Sophie Clark, Patricia Bissett, Mary Sullivan, and the others whose lives were cut short, deserve to have their killer identified with certainty. Whether that killer was Albert DeSalvo or someone who escaped justice remains one of the most enduring mysteries in American criminal history. The clock that began ticking on June 14, 1962, may have stopped with DeSalvo's death in prison, but the questions surrounding the Boston Strangler case continue to echo through time, reminding us that some mysteries resist even our most determined efforts to solve them. What's your take on this case? Share your thoughts below and subscribe to the Crime O'Clock, because the next mystery is already ticking.